Live.
number কত?
16, I think. 16A.
16A.
We're live.
So welcome guys to online debate number 16. On government side we have Saqib, Tausif and Abir, and on opposition we have Mahathir, Noyuli and Farhan. So without further ado, I invite the Prime Minister to the floor. Here.
Everyone, like usual online debate rules, keep your mics muted when speech দিচ্ছে. Only if you have POIs do you unmute your mic and raise it.
Yes, sir.
So basically everyone unmute, mute. Everyone mute. Mahathir as well.
Abir, check
And
group
Saqib.
chat one last time. এটা একটু বলিস.
Yes. Okay, so starting in 3, 2, 1. We think that a world without the timer. Sorry, fuck.
এই নিজেদের টাইম করিস.
Yes.
Mahathir, mic mute কর.
3, 2, 1.
We think that a world without the stories of the greater people in the wars, with the stories of greater people in wars getting shadowed by that to those of regular stories, we never truly understand the motives and incentives these people had to truly call out of these stories to begin with. We think that a world that emphasizes on studying cultural forces and the experiences of ordinary people, we revert to stories that kids will be taught, but not stories that are truly academic in nature. We think that at the end of the day, from side government, we have two explicit burdens, right? Number one, to show you why these people deserve to have their stories told simply because of the amount of greatness they possess and their contribution. And on a secondary level, the burden from Gov is how we fulfill both objectives of the academic study of history. Number one being to understand history in general, and number two, to learn from our mistakes and to learn from our flaws in history and whatnot, right? So let's move on to the first idea, right? Why great people deserve to be highlighted. We think that at the end of the day, it's important, even if these great people are depicted as good or bad, to emphasize on them to begin with. If you're talking about bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's unjust to talk about the person who pressed the bomb for the nuclear weapon, but we should probably talk about Harry Truman if we truly want to understand what led the US to actually nuke an entire part of a country. If we want to talk about wars, then we need to understand the perspectives of the leaders of those wars themselves. If we want to understand the Iran-Iraq war, from a normal perspective, it would just come off as a Sunni-Shia conflict. But it goes far beyond to that. And that's something that we can only understand when we delve into the personalities of Gaddafi and Ayatollah Khomeini. We think that at the end of the day, these are stories that matter most. But on another level, even if these are stories that end up in triumph or in celebration of the lives of these particular people, we think that this is even more important, right? Because of the sheer contribution of these people into leading these people to success in itself. Let's think of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, how he started off as an individual who rallied protests to an individual who basically steered the liberation war and brought to us independence. We wouldn't like to live in such a world where individuals aren't valued for their contribution, and we wouldn't like to live in a world where individuals where the people at the top aren't given any importance whatsoever, and the importance is sheerly on the people that simply follow these orders, right? We think that these leaps that these people or these leaders make from mediocrity to greatness needs to be established. We talk about leaders like Napoleon or Mahatma Gandhi, individuals that started movements and eradicated regimes and whatnot. We think that these people are people that jumped from a state of mediocrity to greatness. And this is something that we all need to learn. And that's something that we can only be learned from history in itself, right? We think that if individuals truly want to get out of our phase of mediocrity and move on to something greater, then it's important that we look towards these particular stories for inspiration rather than lives like us, which end up as similar to lives like us, right? And finally, for those people that actually are born in privilege and end up utilizing this privilege, we think that it's even more important to talk about them, right? Because at the end of the day, these leaders, while they might have been born in privilege, you ended up utilizing their privilege for something good. This negates the thought of them using their privilege to predator over individuals and whatnot. And we feel that these certain acts need to be highlighted as well. To sum up this principle, I've told you the importance of contribution and why these great people contributed far more than regular people, and how it's only justified when these great people get emphasized far more itself, right? How these movements hinged on the hinged on these great people, and how the absence of these great people would have been something that wouldn't have let the war be steered as smoothly in itself. We've told you about the leaps of mediocrity and greatness and the need to establish them, and we've told you about how they've utilized privilege for something good and why that's important. Second idea is to understand history, right? We think that history in itself is something that's really boring. We don't like to hear about negotiations and whatnot. It gets even more boring when you talk about individuals and the blunt they have to face because of these particular wars. We don't have to hear every single story from every single person to understand that war is atrocious in nature. These are simply different stories repackaged, and there are nothing new. But what is essential is understanding why a leader did a particular negotiation. The incentives or the will to protect a country and why that's important is something that we can only learn from leaders, right? We think that if our emphasis is on individuals like George W. Bush after 9/11, we tend to understand the flaws in the American intelligence far better than we would have in a world from a CIA officer, right? Simply because George W. Bush is someone who had much more leverage power, and who screwed up even more to control the CUI, which means that. But however, in a world where we talk about these individual stories, we have less of a wow factor. What does this mean? This means that since the lives of those other people seem as same as us, it doesn't seem like much of a big deal. A kid is only inspired to play football when he sees the likes of Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo and not his local Borobhai. We think at the end of the day, if we want to reach out to more people to aspire to be like these people, to aspire to share the same kind of leadership qualities and the confidence and the decisiveness and like proper decision making and whatnot of these people, it's important that we talk about the people at the top, or else we can't get it. But the final purpose is to learn from our mistakes, right? Conflicts usually come up with bad consequences, and it's important that these never happen again. We think that we can only learn from our mistakes when this is exclusive to the leaders. Leaders in their true essence are true to their motives. They are the ones that show the incentives. It is hard to understand why a Nazism from a Nazi soldier, simply because the Nazi soldier was probably just following orders, in contrast to reading Mein Kampf and understanding what Hitler truly thinks about this ideology to begin with. It's hard to think about a regular individual from Bangladesh who deemed himself as pro-liberationist during the 1970 war, simply because most odds are he hopped into that bandwagon because his friends, his families, and everyone around him did too, all of whom also did so because of a certain bandwagon culture. We think that the presence of bandwagon cultures disable us to think about particular ideologies, and that's something that cannot be changed. So in these instances, it's important to understand from the people that established these bandwagons to begin with. That's essentially these people at power. The idea of a hunger strike isn't something most of us can explain to the efficacy that Mahatma Gandhi can. Simply because Mahatma Gandhi made made the choice to do so. In comparison to just another guy at a protest, we get that this person is only following orders, and we don't get the same kind of insight to his life we would have otherwise. At the end of the day, if we truly want to learn from our mistakes, if we truly want if we truly want proper insight into the war, it needs to come from people in positions of power, because they're the ones that make the call. Very proud to propose. 8 minutes 12 seconds.
Felt like an hour. কি স্পিচ দিলি যে আমি hour মনে হয়েছে। ছি।
Save those.
Hey, Eloke.
Ami, 1 minute.
Okay. No, 1 minute nahi, but like তাড়াতাড়ি.
So I'm Bashash from Aman.
You should be very sad and probably kill yourself.
এখান থেকে বের করো।
Hey,
মান করে আসছে।
Hey, আমি social skip করছি, আমি অনেক ভালো ছেলে।
Hey, then you missed the good part. What?
Exactly. You went to the bad part and you missed the good part.
And
What just happened? ও আসলে লিভ করছে? Damn. না, হ্যাঁ আসলে করছে।
সেটা তো সেল্টিক হাই।
Either that নাহলে নেট কানেকশন খারাপ। Let's go with net connection খারাপ. It'll help me sleep at night. Hey bro, কতক্ষণ? Come on man.
Great. Sorry, everything's flying off. That's why. Damn it. Acha. Starting in 3, 2, 1. We ask you, where they tell you that they want a world where kids understand history better. So, what are they going to do? They're going to teach them about what laws people passed, what laws Obama passed, what laws great leaders passed, and why they passed it. But understand that kids will never see or understand the significance of those laws that were passed if they don't understand those cultural forces that were working there in the first place. So let's move on to some of the rebuttals, and then we'll give you our case, right? So firstly, on the point of kids understanding, they think that they want that history will be made much more interesting if kids watch the leaders carry out all the policies that they've created, right? No, ladies and gentlemen, if a kid doesn't understand why Obama passed the DACA policy, they will never understand the need for that policy in the first place. They'll just dismiss it. Guess what? They'll just eat up that information and throw it out and blurt it out and write that when they have to give an exam. They will never understand how those people who that the DACA policy was protecting were suffering. Since they never understand that, they never give heed to that, they never give significance to that. But moving on, they talked about how Bangabandhu and Gandhi, they created movements and how they went from they took leaps from mediocrity to greatness, yada yada yada. Understand that these people, the kids, will now view Bangabandhu as a random dude who suddenly wanted to start a war and get autonomy, etc., etc., because they never understand how much the people, the local people, the common people were suffering in the first place. All they see is this guy who wants to now randomly start a war and create Gentam, right? But moving on, they talk about how they talk about how these leaders are now are using the privilege that were provided to them. How is that even going to affect a black kid studying history in a developing country? How is that going to make him see the significance of what he's doing and what he's not, right? So what do we give you from our case? We have to prove 2 burdens today. Firstly, how the people understand history better on the outside, and secondly, how we provide a more accurate view of history and why that's important. So,
POI?
Yes, before moving on to my first constructive, yes, POI.
No, I don't think you can ever expect kids to understand in-depth policy, but all kids will ever understand is that war is horrible and war should not be done. That happens underneath both sides, doesn't it?
No, understand that when you tell a kid war is horrible, sure, they understand that war is horrible, but when you show them how much the common people were actually suffering, when you show that a kid is being taken away from his mother and that mother is then being raped and these are the war crimes, That's when they understand the significance of those war crimes. That's when they can visualize and understand how the depth of that situation, and that's when they relate to the situation in the first place, right? So moving on to my first constructive, why students will understand history better. Understand that right now these great cultural figures, figures are just minorities in their heads, right? Because these people are usually people that are living in the more privileged world, in the developed world, white privileged people who have all the resources, etc., etc. So understand that they think that these wars and the political shifts and the cultural shifts happened much more easily because they never understand what the need for those cultural shifts, for those political shifts were in the first place. Because understand what happens under our world. Under our world, we will explain we will explain history in three parts. Firstly, wars. Secondly, cultural shifts, and thirdly, political shifts, and how each of these significant portions of history are better explained under our world. So let's talk about wars. When you show a kid that this leader, that Bangabandhu went out in the streets, or Gandhi went out in the streets and started protesting, started rallying, they never understand why. They never understand the necessity. They never get the purpose of it in the first place. But when you show how the Hindu and the Muslims were quarreling, how much hate crimes were going on, how the West Pakistanis were oppressing the East Pakistanis, taking away their food, taking away all the things that they've earned. When you show that to individuals, when you show the sufferings of the common people to these children, they understand, they relate, they think that yes, now I see why this dude walked out into the streets and started this movement. That is when they start to grow respect for these movements and learn with eagerness, and not just learn because they have to sit for some exam in the near future. But let's talk about political shifts, right? Why monarchy transformed into democracy. When you don't show the kids that these during the monarchy period, the common people were being oppressed by the hierarchy, right? When you don't show them that these people weren't getting respect at all, the kids never understand why that shift came in the first place. They never even give heed or significance to that shift at all. But when you when you do show that, these people understand why democracy is there, why democracy is important, and why democracy is necessary in the first place. This is because since we're showing the kids the picture of how we achieved fame and how the common people went from their sufferings and how much they suffered, and how they gradually went on to achieving what they did, and the process of it all. We think that kids get a more accurate view of history in the first place. We don't want kids to just learn history because they have to sit for an exam. We don't want kids to learn about policies without understanding why those policies were there in the first place. If you only talk to the kids about what the leaders did, they will never understand why they did it. They will never grow any respect for those leaders if they don't understand the cultural forces that forced them to do that, if they don't understand the cultural obstacles that were in position in the first place, and the cultural obstacles that the common people had to overcome. Because we give you a more accurate view of history, and because we show you how history is better understood by the children under our world, we think that we very clearly win this debate. Thank you. 8 minutes, 12 seconds.
Time. Awesome. DPM.
Oh my god, same. আমারও 8 minutes 12 seconds ছিল একদম exactly.
আরে damn! Spinning.
Wow. কিছু হয়ে যাচ্ছে নাকি? Damn.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ শোনা যাচ্ছে।
Acha, wait, I'll set up the timer.
Mahathir কি হয়েছে ডায়রিয়া?
Yes, Mahathir.
Bro, this is live, Kintu. Just saying.
Grind harder. Oh.
I love you, Sakib.
There are worse things that have been
Hello.
said during live sessions.
Hello, BTC butterflies. That
True.
was Mahathir.
গতকালকে কে জানি রাজক নে কি জানি বলতেছিল।
এই
Raju
আস্তে
to bal.
আস্তে আস্তে এই তো
Guys?
এই তো। এবার আমি
May I-
বলি এবার
may I
আমি
start?
বলছি।
May I start?
হ্যাঁ,
Everyone ready?
Start.
হ্যাঁ জি।
Yep. Sure.
The stance from team government is that history should not be a rant about how things were so oppressive and how it was so problematic in the past, ladies and gentlemen, but it should be about how these oppressive regimes were challenged and how the mechanism in which these challenges worked and what led to collectivization of people and actual change, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, let me point out how they never engaged with our principle of how these people who have sacrificed so much to challenge oppressive regimes, who have sacrificed so much to create social change, ladies and gentlemen, deserve to be celebrated in the first place. They never said why these people do not deserve to be celebrated in the first place. Why do we believe this principle was important? Because at the end of the day, in the past, ladies and gentlemen, they have had contributions that were vital to our identity right now. But even in the future, ladies and gentlemen, whoever goes on to create actual change, whoever goes on to become politicians or people with privilege, these people need incentive to create that change. The moment we do not celebrate this change, the moment we do not celebrate these sacrifices, we reduce that incentive to create actual change. Hence, since they never engage with our principle, that still stands, right? And that is so important. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, they never tell us how history becomes more interesting the moment you ensure that there is a political rant about how 200 years of oppression was so bad and whatnot, ladies and gentlemen. We believe at the end of the day, they simply strawmanned our case to say that the stories of leaders will not incorporate the stories of struggle, right? Let me reframe Noeli's argument in a much better way. They say that you do not understand the contribution of these leaders without the context of that contribution. We believe that when you tell Gandhi's story, it does not come in randomly and say that he led a march and that led to India becoming independent. It starts with the story of 200 years of oppression and how that incentivized Gandhi to go ahead and create change, ladies and gentlemen. Both of these do not occur in a vacuum, but they're intertwined, and that comes in the story of that leader, right? But secondly, what you need to understand is that you only show the anger of oppression, but you never show how one person or that institution collectivized to change that oppression in the first place. When you only rant about the problems and oppressions, ladies and gentlemen, the moment we celebrate institutions or these people who created change, ladies and gentlemen, we show a proper mechanism and we give people hope about their current struggles, about the current oppressive regimes, that when you can endure these sacrifices, when you can endure these struggles, you can also create change, and these are not permanent. Sit down. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, they never engage with how why it is so important to ensure that these portraying history, learning from our mistakes, is so important, ladies and gentlemen. Because what you need to understand here is that people who study academic history are people who will go on to become future politicians, ladies and gentlemen. The moment we analyze choices of current leaders or past leaders and we say why they were good or bad, ladies and gentlemen, we believe we create a better mechanism through which they can scrutinize these choices and make much better decisions in the first place. We believe ordinary people get to scrutinize these decisions even better, ladies and gentlemen, which creates better democracies because everyone becomes better decision makers, right? But lastly, ladies and gentlemen, Abir told you how we accrue greater hope when we show that there is a mechanism through which change occurs, instead of just ranting about the cultural shifts that led to problems and whatnot, ladies and gentlemen. What you need to understand is that when we talk about ordinary people, we talk about people who simply follow the bandwagon. When we talk about how cultural shifts occur, we only talk about what was existent or prevalent during that time. That is to say that we only talk about how early marriage is so problematic, right? Or how the British colonizing India was so problematic, without showing why this colonization took place in the first place, how we could stop future colonizations or future problems like these, ladies and gentlemen. We never understand the incentive or the mindset of people who create these oppressive regimes, or who create these who alleviate this oppression into better forms of into better societies, ladies and gentlemen. Thus, we believe that talking about these leaders or institutions is so important, rather than just ranting about the problems or ordinary people who simply follow the bandwagon and go ahead with whatever equivalent. Before moving on to my extension, sure, Mahathir.
We agree that stories don't happen in a vacuum. Understand that Gandhi does not have a does not principally have a monopoly over that change. The change that occurred in India was a contribution of. Why does Gandhi get all of that?
Well, at the end of the day, we're never saying that we will celebrate only one individual in a particular struggle, right? When we celebrate Gandhi, we also celebrate Jinnah, right? We believe that the moment you celebrate one individual, other counter narratives come up eventually, ladies and gentlemen. But the moment when you like spread that narrative, that is to say, you celebrate an average random individual, ladies and gentlemen, we believe these counter narratives do not come into play, right? Because, and secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we believe in order to create that wow effect, right, to incentivize people to go ahead and read further, to go ahead and like take greater interest in history, we believe talking about these exclusive leaders who create the most amount of change is important, because ordinary people simply do not garner that wow expression when you talk about them, ladies and gentlemen. It's my extensions, right? How do we set a better narrative of how privilege should be redistributed in the current society? The context of this argument is that most privileged people are evil, right? That is, they're selfish. However, the people we celebrate in our world are the ones who are the only particular people who did not misuse their privilege once they got it, right? That is to say, Nelson Mandela, when he became president, right, he did not accrue his power to just benefit himself, but he cancelled out apartheid, right? We saw that how when Gandhi gained airtime, he used that to create social change instead of just having greater followers, right? So we show how these people use their privilege to create massive social improvement or to create massive social harm. That is in the case of Hitler, right? When we talk about, so the argument plays out in two layers. Firstly, when we talk about these people, we create a culture where the rich privileged people aspire to be this celebrated, right? The rich privileged people get to know how Hitler was so hated upon, and how Gandhi, being like Gandhi is so loved upon, how being philanthropical like Bill Gates is something people love, right? Which is what incentivizes these people with privilege in the current society to contribute towards this alleviation of oppression, right? But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we believe society also learns to expect this redistribution of privilege, ladies and gentlemen. We believe this is the principle which is on which the basis of taxation and other forms of redistribution, such as scholarships and whatnot, work, ladies and gentlemen. We believe when we talk about how this privilege should be, when we set a set narrative of how privilege should be redistributed, ladies and gentlemen, by celebrating leaders who did so, we believe we create this culture where we create greater social incentive to do good, right? So what is why is this argument so exclusive and only pans out under our world? We believe rich people with privilege will never be able to relate to ordinary people when you only talk about them, right? We will never be able to relate to cultural shifts, because at the end of the day, they do not care about social norms that they are immune to, right? But ladies and gentlemen, the moment you incorporate these inspirational figures and tell them that, you see, you should emulate to be like him, right? At the end of the day, these people now have a positive role model to emulate, right? We believe this has a greater reach, because at the end of the day, you inspire poor people to not just conform to the system and just learn to bear these and wait for change to occur, but to take an active step in ensuring that change occurs, and they are the ones who collectivize to create that change. But secondly, we also ensure that the rich people who have the most amount of social capital, take active interest in redistributing their privilege and creating that change, because that is something that we glorify under our world. What do we do from team government? We showed you how we make history more interesting by ensuring that people who have done wow things in life get greater airtime. We ensure that how people become better decision makers when you scrutinize the contributions that these historical figures have made. We showed you how a mechanism of change is so very important to glorify in this scenario, and how this creates more hope. But lastly, ladies and gentlemen, we incentivize people, both rich and poor, to ensure that they use whatever capital they have to take action. We're very proud to propose. The motion stands. Thank you. 8 minutes and 20 seconds.
Awesome. Diallo. Mahathir na Diallo?
Hello, na. I'm
Plot twist.
Diallo ke?
Ami.
Farhan. Ready?
Yeah.
Farhan Kamrul.
Nah.
Farhan Tajwar.
Oh.
Plot twist, Farhan Kamrul is in our team.
এই প্লট টুইস্টে হইলে জিতার চান্স থাকতো। স্যাড।
ও তাই, আমার স্পিচটা শুনে নাও আপনার প্লিজ।
Wow, thanks Afnan.
তার মানে বলতেছো ফারহানের স্পিচটা বাজে হবে, এটা কি ছিল?
Damn. তুমি না আমারে চাইলা
Damn.
মাহাতির
দেখ মাতের এত লো ইম্প্যাক্ট স্পিকার
গুটি, গুটি।
কিছু করা যায় না।
তোমাকে আমি খাটে চাই তাজওয়ার।
Stop with.
oh
Please. Dude, this is going on YouTube, man.
don't make this more gay than it
আমাদের
already
কত viewers আছে?
আচ্ছা
হ্যাঁ,
guys,
অনেক
start.
viewers আছে YouTube.
is.
অনেক।
There
এখনই
are
3 জন আছে।
200 people watching this right now.
এখনই 3 জন আছে। লল। Hi
People.
random 3 people watching.
ইংল্যান্ডে এবিপি প্রেপ যারা করছে সবাই ভিডিও দেখতেছে।
কারা এত লাইফলেস দেখতেছে?
এই ফারহান শুরু কর হিয়ার
Okay,
হিয়ার।
fine. Before I move on to my comparatives, I'd like to engage to one specific point that Sakib Bhai mentioned in his speech. This point has largely to do with the fact that we tackle narratives of villainizing the rich and like how it acts as a counter narrative against these people. We think that this is absolutely wrong in the very first place, that the attempt of removal of the narrative sacrifices exposure to the most vulnerable people in the very first place. So like what are we talking about? We're talking about removing narratives of villainizing the rich, which the rich themselves can do simply because of having a greater amount of social capital, and that's sacrificing exposure to the most vulnerable people. What are the kinds of people we're talking about? We're talking about minorities who suffered the most during the conflict. We're talking about people like the Jews who suffered the most during Hitler's regime. We're talking about the general population of East Pakistan that suffered during the Pakistani regime. So we think that if we take this on a comparative, our obligation to represent the most vulnerable and the most oppressed people is higher than representing the rich people, because minorities are simply the more vulnerable party in this group, right? So we don't think how that argument even makes sense. But in a secondary layer, we think that the role of history is not to remove like these kinds of preconceived notions, but rather to represent events that have taken place in the past in an accurate and unbiased way. And we think that that's something we do under our side, and something that I'll further delve into in my comparatives. Moving on to my comparatives. My first comparative will be on the topics of prevention of conflict and like learning from past mistakes and implementing those in the future. So let us first paint a clear picture as to what their world actually looks like, right? So what they're saying is essentially this, that somehow, without explaining the link, that understanding the motives of violence will magically improve the state of conflicts more than understanding the suffering of common people. Understand the horrible principle that lies behind these words, because their world is one where justifications behind conflict are prioritized above sufferings of the people who suffered because of those policies. What do you mean by this? We mean that under their world is one where Hitler's irrational hatred on Jews is more focused than how the Jews suffered themselves. We also think that this narrative also carries down to like the recent events in the past, whereby the Bush administration's paranoia about Muslims is given more priority than how the regular Muslims of America suffer due to the various policies of the Bush administration. We think that there's one main takeaway from this argument. We think that this world is one where people become more desensitized to violence. Why is this the case? Like, let me give an example. When you open the history book, the first chapter that you see is not now on colonialism and how African people who were brought to America forcefully suffered due to the ruthless torture of the American people. But history now becomes more about how Columbus discovered America and how he was so great. And we think that this version of history is one that further ignores what Columbus did after he got to America. That amount of torture he made the Red Indians go through. Like, these are the kinds of narratives that gain more coverage into our world, because we simply give these people the priority. And we think that this is a more accurate version of history, because we think that the impacts of the general population and their culture play a greater role in shaping the world as it is today than the impacts of a handful of people. So what happens under our world on a comparative? We think that if you want people to feel anger towards violence, we think need sympathy from the people of the present. And we think that that's something we can achieve more greater under our world. Why is this the case? Because understand that now the focus becomes the focus shifts from complicated policies and political gibberish to focusing more on mothers losing children during the 1971 war. The focus becomes more on the lack of food supply that European countries faced during both the world wars. It points to how entire cities were bombed, destroyed, how millions of people lost their homes. And we think that this is the kind of focus that we need if we want people to be to grow resistance against violence. Because we think that these common people are more relatable, their sufferings are more likely to hit a soft spot. Because it's simply like this. When you see that people just like you, ordinary people, who lead ordinary lives, whose life is similar to you, going through massive amounts of violence, you're more likely to feel sympathy for those people than like understanding why this legislation was passed. Like that's not something sympathy in the very first place. And like then they also talked about how we never show the process of institutions uniting together in order to depicting the struggle. We think that that's something that happens under our world more on a comparative, because we are the only side in this debate that shows how the people were affected, how the people united together, and how the people triumphed, not the politicians, not the not the legislation. So when we view history from the perspectives of the people who were suffering, we think that we are able to view their emotions and capture their thoughts better under our world. And that's something very important. My second comparative will be on the accuracy of history. So understand that under their world, what happens is that much of history remains blurred. Why is this the case? Because understand the nature of the most influential people on the planet. We think that they are not part of the majority of the population. Like we think that in, like say in medieval Europe, most of the great figures were part of the nobility, and their views and their way of life was something that was very distant from the ordinary populations. And them being a minority means that we view history from the lens of a privileged few rather than getting a more accurate version. But what happens on a comparative under our world? We think that we give a more accurate version of world events because we think that the general masses and their interactions with their culture is what has shaped history more than a handful of influential figures. Why is this the case? Because they are the ones who suffered from the decisions of politicians. These people have had a dominant part in developing the culture, in developing the arts, in developing the societal phenomena that has resulted in the world as it is today. But even if we take their best case and let's say consider their arguments about how they make history more interesting, we think that that's also an argument that we have under our side of the world. Why is this again? Because under our world, history becomes more relatable when people see that people that they're studying about are also regular people, as I've already discussed before. So we think that now you're more like to pick up the history book and think about how people who were similar to me, people who were similar to my friends, lived their lives 100 years ago. On a comparative, they become bored under their world with the plethora of politicians and complicated legislation because that's simply something they can't relate to, like because they were simply distant from the majority of the population. So at the end of the day, we win this debate because we ensure history's role is better fulfilled, that history becomes so relatable, that people are more resistant to violence, and that they grow more sympathy for the people who suffered the most and not view history through the lens of a privileged few. Very proud to oppose. 8 minutes, 34 seconds.
Tausif, can you check the messenger group chat?
আমাকে দাও, আমি দেখবো।
দেখতে স্যার।
Whoa, that's some creepy shit. এটা creepy ছিল, এটা যেই ছিল, এটা creepy ছিল. Because কেটে গেছে. Sounded like a fucking snake.
Okay, good. That's very safe.
Hey, Shubhakar.
This is what happens when you try to sound scared.
Ow.
Sound like you're being possessed.
না, it sounds
I
like
am
মাহাতির যা চাইতেছিল
মান
ফাইনালি
করছি
পাইছে।
possessed হবো না।
Shash.
শুরু কর তৌসিফ।
Timer recorder.
হাহা, শাসি নিচ্ছিল। হা হা হা। Someone kill me.
There are 4 things I need to prove in order to win this debate. Firstly, a clarification as to what the narrative looks like on each side of this debate, which is horribly missing for the bulk of this debate. Secondly, who do we celebrate on a principle level and how opposition has failed to engage with us on that? Second, which fulfills the burdens of academic history, in which I'll be talking about 3 things. Number 1, accuracy. Number 2, appeal. And number 2, the amount we can learn from history. But finally, could change happen in the absence of leaders? I'm going to talk about the last thing. I'm going to talk about the clarification first before I move on to the question. So, understand that opposition strawmans our entire notion and says that when we are celebrating leaders, that's all we're celebrating. We're not going to talk about, the background behind why the leaders did what they did. We don't talk about the background of the common emotions that the leaders consolidated in order for their emotions to go forward. We feel that is an untrue version, untrue and unrealistic burden that they push upon us. We tell you that under our world, we still talk about the background of this. We still talk about how blacks were being oppressed in apartheid South Africa. But what do we prioritize? We prioritize the idea that, Nelson Mandela, despite the amounts of sacrifice that she had to do, still stood up and accrued and consolidated that social emotion and made sure that an effective change was brought about for these black people that were suffering under apartheid. Under their side of the world, their claim is that Nelson Mandela was inconsequential, that without a leader, that a movement without a leader would have succeeded either ways. That, Nelson Mandela, even if he wasn't there, apartheid would be fought effectively on the level that it was. We feel that that's inaccurate. If their idea is to preserve accuracy, that's an inaccurate version of history to begin with. But also we feel that is a fallacious version of history in which you do not reward the amounts of sacrifice that people like Nelson Mandela, people like Abraham Lincoln went through in order to enact those kinds of policy in the very first place. So that's a description of what the narrative looks like on each side. Our both worlds talks about the people, both worlds talk about the leaders. It's about what you prioritize, it's about what you put first, it's about what you hold more important in those specific movements in the very first place. Taking that into consideration, let's talk about whether change would happen in the absence of leaders. Their entire idea centers around the idea that, we need to understand the vulnerabilities of these people. We need to understand the suffering that these people go through. Because, they're the most vulnerable people in the world. Never telling us how exaggerating or talking about the vulnerabilities or the amounts of suffering that these people go through, if it is truly absent under our world, is necessary or does bring about actual change in today's world. If the objective of history is to make people learn from it, is to make sure that people can put current decisions into some form of context, I don't see how talking about the most vulnerable people helps you to make sure that the policies that you enact today doesn't hurt the kind of vulnerable people that are present today. The comparative here is we understand that some people are disproportionately hurt by policy. We understand that some people are hurt by wars, and we do talk about that. But more importantly, we make sure that people are less likely to be hurt by things like war again, because we analyze the kinds of decisions that went into making sure that war happened in the first place. We analyze the kinds of decisions that these leaders took to make sure that them propped up in the first place. And that is how we minimize suffering of the most vulnerable under status quo, under our world. But before I move on to my second question, sure.
Tosif, the nature of problems today is neo-colonization, is white privilege. Your world allows these people to get away with saying, no, we had great people solve these issues. How are you solving it?
understand, we don't say that, you know what, great people pop out of nowhere and solve these issues. We constructively show you that great people come out of oftentimes extreme amounts of disadvantage, that people shouldn't give up hope, that there will be someone, even you can be that someone who crawls out of those crevices of poverty, crevices of disadvantage, and lead a movement to do so. But we think that it's better under our side because we ensure that people are incentivized to do so because their names will be written in the history books, as opposed to them being a faceless part of a crowd that will be generally described in the history books, in which they have no incentive to do so, but moreover, they have no direction in which they move their motion forward. So let's talk about principles. We've clearly shown to you that, you know what, people principally deserve to be celebrated because of the sacrifices they make. Their only contention to this is, you know what, we should also celebrate vulnerable people, but never showed us how that's exclusive to our motion or their motion in and of itself. We still talk about vulnerabilities, we still talk about the costs of war, but we talk about how people rose up and made those sacrifices to make sure that those sufferings stop. And we believe those sacrifices warrant a principal justification for them to be celebrated in the first place. But how? But secondly, how we fulfill the burden of academic history? Accuracy. We don't think it's accurate to say that the only thing that happened in history was people suffering. There were people who accrued that emotion and made sure actual change occurred. Their idea is that, you know what, when we talk about Columbus, we'll not talk about the black slaves anymore. One, we still talk about the black slaves, all right, but more importantly, it's also important to talk about Columbus, because only by then can we understand or recognize institutions that were oppressive. We need to talk about Hitler, we need to talk about Stalin in order to understand the kinds of leaders that can come up and cause these kinds of sufferings. Understand that that is simply absent under your world, in which you say that this is a gradual process which just happened to came about because of the social emotions of these people. But more importantly, we don't think people have an autonomy over the social emotions that they feel. We've clearly shown you in our first constructive that people are a result of their circumstances, and more often than not, these people will simply jump on the bandwagon and follow along whatever lines that we talk about. That Jews were in their heyday, the Jews, when they were being persecuted, felt like there was no alternative to this. It's only when World War II happened, when people like Churchill went in and said that, you know what, there can be a change. Jews don't need to be persecuted. That these leaders changed social emotion. And that is inherently important under our scenario, where we tell you that these leaders are necessary to shape the social emotions that dictate what these people do. But more importantly, where we talk about learning, we tell you that people are more likely to be able to analyze the kinds of policy that these people implemented. That was the first argument, that when we question the things that people in powers of those times did, is the only moment that we can make better decisions as lawmakers today. Their idea is that, you know what, the only people who learn history are kids. We don't believe that. There are actual historians who learn history, people who are going to be politicians that learn history. And it's absolutely imperative that we teach them how to make better policies in the first place. How do you do that? By making sure that we put historical examples of policies into context for them, and making sure that they can apply those policies into a context which is relevant to the current world. Something that you completely shadow out under your motion, where you tell them that policy was inconsequential or not important in the change that occurred. But finally, appeal. We told you that people are more likely to look up to role models than they are to look at each other. We tell you that relatability isn't a metric on which you create a pill. It's about people who went that extra mile, who went up and beyond their call of duty and did more for the country than could ever be imaginable. This is what creates appeal towards history. This is what makes sure that people come into history. And in an attempt to write themselves into history books, they try to do something equally great. We're extremely proud to propose.
Pinnick, nice.